A report from this year's annual conference from one of our lay members.
A few weeks ago, Lorna provided an excellent synopsis of the Michigan Annual Conference. She reviewed the major legislation and spoke eloquently of the important messages that were powerfully conveyed by Bishop Bard, Derek Scott, Cynthia Wilson, and other presenters and worship leaders. I'm not really sure that I could add much to her report about what happened at annual conference. So instead, I want to use this opportunity to say a few words about how my experience as a lay delegate affected me personally. What did it mean to be a part of this remotely orchestrated gathering of United Methodists from across our state? What kind of a mark did it leave on my heart? When I logged on to join the annual conference, I confess that I was skeptical about how much I would get out of the experience. My earlier experiences participating in an annual conference did not paint an especially auspicious picture in my mind. I was one of your delegates in 2020 when the conference was reduced to the barest of bones due to the pandemic. And basically, we made sure that our pastor's benefits were taken care of and then called it a day. Prior to that, I would have to go back more than 35 years when my dad, who if you don't know was a United Methodist elder, he would load me up in the car and we'd make the long drive to Northern Illinois University, where I would sit at a long, long table in a big, big ballroom and listen to long, long-winded people give boring, boring speeches. My sole entertainment was a pencil and a stack of scratch paper. Kids these days really have no idea. So those were my memories of annual conference. And to this, we add the fact that this year's conference, like last year, was taking place remotely. I have spent an extraordinary number of hours staring at a Zoom window over the past year and a half. And all of those hours of meetings and lectures and advising sessions and campus visits were at best a pale imitation of what I would consider to be the real thing, i.e., people talking to one another in the same room, face to face, reading each other's body language, and not trying to keep their cat from walking across the keyboard, or their dog from crawling into their lap in the middle of a meeting. I have to be completely honest, the idea of spending days sitting in front of my computer, listening to sermons and debating legislation did not fill me with a great deal of enthusiasm. So it was with some surprise that I found myself on the first day of the conference drawn in by the story of Derek Scott III, a United Methodist campus minister from Florida who headlined the laity event and kicked off the conference. I should mention here that you can all watch all of the services and plenary sessions of the Michigan Annual Conference on the conference website, which is, you can just Google it, 2021 Michigan United Methodist Church Conference. And I would actually encourage you to check out Derek's talk, because I really found it to be both inspiring and challenging in a good way. It was a message that I think we all can benefit from hearing. But to give a quick overview, Derek described growing up in a family for which the church was central. They would be the first to arrive before a service or before an event to help prepare. They'd be the last to turn out the lights and lock up and head home. I could certainly relate to this, as that pretty well describes my own experience growing up in the United Methodist Church. Believe me, I have bussed more tables at church potlucks than I think anyone alive on the planet. I took great pride in my bussing ability. When Derek attended college, he discovered campus ministry, and as his involvement in that ministry deepened, he began to be urged to seek ordination by friends and mentors. Though the idea of becoming part of the ordained clergy didn't really resonate with him, he did know that he wanted to be, in his words, where the action is. He wanted to have an impact, to serve in ministry, to be more than just, quote, a butt in a seat in a church. And so, as far as he knew, ordination was the only path that would allow him to be deeply involved in building the kingdom of God in the way that he wanted to be involved. So he went ahead and entered seminary. But despite the sincerity of his conviction, didn't really feel that God was calling him to any particular role in the church. Did God want him to be an elder, a deacon, a local pastor? Nothing resonated. Until one day, when in a small group discussion with other candidates for ordination, his mentor began discussing the various pastoral roles, and in passing mentioned the laity, but nobody there was, everyone there was looking towards ordination, so she was just going to brush right past the laity, and Derek said, hey, hold on, I want to hear more about this. What does it mean to be laity, a lay member of the church? Derek said that in that moment, he could have sworn he heard Jesus say, that's what I want you to do. That's where I want you to use your gifts. So he dropped out of seminary. He said that after making his decision, he was afraid that this would mean the end of his participation in ministry. He thought that, the people around him who were part of the campus ministry that he was so devoted to would say, well, look, you're obviously not really serious. You're not going to go for ordination, so really, best if you just be a butt in a seat in the church. But that's not what happened. Instead, he found, in his words, a church that was ready to receive a lay person who knew their call, and his participation in ministry only grew. He discovered that as part of the laity, he is able to share God's grace in contexts that might be trickier for fully ordained clergy to navigate. Among other things, Derek is a bartender. And it should come as no surprise that in that role he gets plenty of opportunities to share Christ's love with folks who really need it, and who also might not be especially likely to seek out the ear of a pastor. In hearing Derek's story, I was struck by the idea of being called to the laity. I confess that I have never really thought of lay membership in the church as something that one might be specifically called to. I've always thought of it as more of the default option. Sort of a nice way of saying, everybody in the church who's not the clergy. It didn't seem like it required a call at all. But as I thought about this, I began to think, is that really true? We live at a time when 53% of Americans are not connected to a faith community of any kind. Increasingly, being unchurched is the default status. So what then calls us to participate in the life of the church as lay members? And in what ways are we called to participate? Derek's example demonstrates how we all have a vital role to play in the ministry of the church. This is something that we say over and over. You hear it all the time. But I freely admit that it doesn't always sink in with me. What does it mean to be called to the laity, to this role that we have, that I have? The Book of Discipline reminds us, quote, every layperson is called to carry out the Great Commission from Matthew 28, verses 16 through 20, which Kim read to us this morning. Every layperson is called to be missional. The witness of the laity, their Christ-like examples of everyday living, as well as the sharing of their own faith experiences of the gospel, is the primary evangelistic ministry through which all people will come to know Christ. We are the hands of the church. Clergy can't do all the heavy lifting. We, the laity, are responsible for sharing the love of Christ with the world. So as members of the laity, what are we, what are you specifically called to do? Obviously, you don't have to tell me the answer to that question, but I hope that you keep the question in your heart and reflect and act on it daily. In Scouts, we say that you should do a good turn daily. And I try to get my Scouts in Troop 372 to think about that every day. Hold that in their heart. Because it's an easy thing to do a good turn daily, but it's also an easy thing to do to forget that that is your role. And so I think being intentional about thinking about our call, what are we called to do, is really important. It takes a little bit of effort to keep that in our heart and use that to guide us. As you all know, we live in a world that is racked by ongoing turmoil. Our geographical landscape is being ravaged by environmental disasters, including wildfires, storms, floods, and droughts of unprecedented scale and frequency. Our economic and public health landscapes have been roiled by the pandemic. Our social landscape is being rocked by continuing revelations of the Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and other social justice movements, while attacks on democratic institutions are increasingly considered to be acceptable mainstream positions by a disturbingly large proportion of the American electorate. To quote Dr. Cynthia Wilson from the conference's Saturday morning worship service, "We've watched the dumbing down of the moral character of America." The need for United Methodist laity to step up and share Christ's love with a hurting world has never in my lifetime, and perhaps in your lifetime, ever been greater. This is no time to sit on the sidelines, to be just another seat, but in a seat in a church. And indeed, the turmoil is not only outside of the United Methodist Church. Opposing positions on matters of race, sexual orientation, and other social issues were clearly on display during the legislative sessions of the annual conference, as delegates sparred over legislation addressing issues of inclusivity, Christian nationalism, and reproductive rights. And all of this debate took place even as the big question, capital B, capital Q, lurked in the back of the minds of every delegate. What will be the fate of the church after the next meeting of the General Conference, hopefully to take place in 2022? Though the future is unclear, it is certain that more change is coming. The tumultuous times in which we are living inspired the theme of the annual conference, singing the Lord's song. This theme drew from Psalm 137, which describes the lament of the Israelites as they are torn away from their homeland by the Babylonians. The question asked by the Israelites, how can we sing the Lord's song while in a foreign land, is fully appropriate for us to ask today. Though most of us haven't been uprooted from our homes, the world in which we are living may seem more and more foreign to us all the time. But I want you to know that despite all of the uncertainty and struggle and heartache, despite the fact that Bishop Bard and the other worship leaders at annual conference did not shy away from addressing the troubled times in which we find ourselves, by the close of the conference, I was left with a profound sense of relief, optimism, and hope, somewhat amazingly. I felt relief because I listened and watched as a strong majority of Michigan United Methodists rejected proposals that would have caused harm to vulnerable people who deserve to be loved and uplifted rather than stigmatized. I felt optimism because I saw the strength and resiliency of a diverse body of faithful people who are united and motivated by their love of Christ and their desire to share that love with those who need it. I felt hope because I began to see what a post-General Conference 2022 United Methodist Church might possibly look like. And I realized that if that church looks something like the Michigan Annual Conference of 2021, I think we're going to be okay. At the start of each session of annual conference, an intro video was played to let people know that it was time to get back to their computers. Usually such clips get pretty tedious after about the third time you've watched it. But in this case, I actually think that the conference organizers did a really beautiful job. In this 1-minute clip, against a soaring and energizing soundtrack, we are asked the critical question, how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? We are reminded of the onslaught of challenges that we faced over the past year in the clip, with images of wildfires in California, the pandemic, and getting vaccinations, the flood in Midland, the assault on the U.S. Capitol, reckonings regarding race, gender, and human sexuality. But then, the clip gives us an answer to the question. We're shown images of Michigan United Methodists singing the Lord's song by finding new and creative ways to worship. We see Michigan United Methodists gathering food and supplies to donate to people whose lives were upended by the events of 2020. We see conversations across racial boundaries and visits to shut-ins. We see just a few of the many ways that we as laity in the Michigan Annual Conference can keep singing the Lord's song even when the land is looking mighty foreign indeed. Ian, can you go ahead and play that clip? pictures are of Michigan United Methodists. Well, I don't know about all of them, but I do know that 3 of them are. Because if you watch closely, this crew pops up for the briefest of moments. Did you catch them? They were in there. So this is tech support here on the right. That's Ian. And that's Tony on the far left. Right, Kim? Mm-hmm. Yep. And I am afraid that I don't know the name of the person in the middle, but I believe that those 2 are members of Mitchell. And this picture was taken when we were out cleaning up, right before we were out cleaning up the highway, US 41. And I did not see this the first 24 times I saw this clip. And it wasn't until last night that I was actually going through frame by frame because I wanted to know what all those pictures were of. And this popped up and I said, my gosh, that's my son. I had no idea. So we here at Marquette Hope are singing the Lord's song by picking up trash on the highway, by supporting room at the inn, by continuing to live missionally, and by sharing Christ's love with the world. As we go forward into an uncertain future, I hope that you all will share in the sense of optimism that I bring to you from the 2021 Michigan Annual Conference, and find joy and inspiration in being called to the laity of the United Methodist Church.